Aloha, welcome back to Hawaii News Now's extended stream. I'm Emily Cristobal, and today we have part 2 of discussing Hawaii's housing crisis on the Debrief. Hawaii has now entered 7 straight years of population decline, and as housing and other living expenses continue to rise, more people may have to make the tough decision to leave. But the state is working on solutions, and key lawmakers joined the debrief to detail some of their plans in housing Hawaii and its future. And here is part 2 of the debrief. Aloha, welcome to the debrief from Hawaii News Now, where we are continuing our conversation on Hawaii's housing crisis. I'm your host, Emily Cristobal. In the past episode, we sat down with State Senator Stanley Chang and State Representative Troy Hashimoto. We discussed recent measures signed by the governor that are working to house locals and Native Hawaiians. This includes the implementation of a 99-year leasehold program, as well as talking about the dire need to not only house current residents, but also Hawaii's future. In this episode, we now address concerns and questions raised by our Hawaii News Now viewers, and question what lawmakers are doing now to improve housing across the islands. When discussing the housing crisis in Hawaii, we also reached out to our viewers on social media to kind of get their insight as to how they're feeling about this. You know, a lot of the people in the comments on our social media pages, they often criticize outside investors or people from the continental US or even international for buying up homes in Hawaii, and thus they say that they are driving up the prices. Is there anything being done currently to prevent outside buyers from buying homes and units in Hawaii?
That's one of the most common questions that I think always comes up in our work. And that's why for the proposals that I've been talking about, like our Aloha Homes model, the buyers would be restricted to Hawaii residents who would also have to be owner-occupants and also own no other real property. So this is not for landlords. This is housing for people who only have a principal residence at that unit. The question about whether we restrict the existing market to outside buyers is an interesting one, because we actually do a lot more of that than people think. When I was on the city council 10 years ago, the residential A classification passed, and that's a different property tax classification for units that are not owner-occupied over $1 million. And that marginal rate is actually now 3 times the property tax rate of an owner-occupied unit. And I mean, triple the tax rate is kind of a drastic, increase. Now, there are a lot of the programs that both Representative Hashimoto and I have already discussed have those owner occupancy restrictions on them already. They're not always 100% enforced, but I want to go back again to those 13,000 high school local people who are graduating from high school every year. We don't even build enough for even 20% of them. We only build 2,000 units a year. So we are not even coming close to housing just the natural rate of population increase, which is why even if we were to build Trump's wall around Hawaii and kick out every single wealthy overseas investor, every single Airbnb, every single, homeless person on a one-way ticket, and all of these boogeymen that we have in Hawaii, we would not be building nearly enough housing just to house local people and local generations. So that's why I've been so focused on increasing housing supply, even though I know that there's a lot of questions out there about how we can restrict demand.
Representative Hashimoto, I actually saw you writing some notes down. Is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
I think the biggest tool that we have as government in kind of deterring those who aren't owners, right, owner-occupying homes is taxation, right? And the only way that we're going to get second home buyers out of this market is if we make it very, very expensive. I think residential A was a very important step forward. But I think you have to go further than that. I think when you take a look at real property taxes here in the state of Hawaii, that is part of the cause on why we have so much outside speculation, because real property taxes don't fund schools. So as a result, real property taxes here in Hawaii are fairly low when you compare it across the nation. And so I think the important thing is that we need to really raise the property taxes on those who aren't homeowners, who are owner-occupied residences, right, to kind of force out that speculation. So I think Maui has done a pretty good job of trying to do that. What they do is they make a really high rate on that second home. To me, it's not high enough, but they've raised it quite substantially over the past couple of years. And then they're giving out exemptions if you're actually going to rent it out to people. And so that will allow, for if you want to buy a home to rent out, then you can pay that lower property tax. But if you're not, and you're going to be, a snowbird, you're going to pay a lot more than you were before. But it's still, as I said, it's still very, very low. And so I think we're going to have to really rethink our taxation methods. We want to promote, those who are homeowners, owner-occupied, as best as we can. And we want to disincentivize everyone else, right? And that's really the way that we can do it. But unfortunately, we haven't been able to get that rate high enough to truly disincentivize. And I think that's the way that we're going to have to do it. All the counties are going to have to get on board. I think some counties have done it better than others, but I think that is the true root of what we're trying to get at. And I think the thinking is when the state asked for a portion of the real property taxes, we wanted to be a part of that solution. Of course, that constitutional amendment failed because it failed a legal test. But I think that was the thought process of some legislators at that time when they wanted to put that ballot initiative onto the ballot to say, hey, there's more room for us to charge more real property taxes. So why doesn't the state get a cut?
Yes, and you talked about you want that rate to be higher. Can you put a number on that?
Well, so if you take a look at what someone pays, I'll use Maui terms because I know that fairly well. So currently the homeowner rate, so this is if you're owner occupied, you pay $2.60 per thousand. So probably for an $800, $1,000 home, you're paying, maybe $1,500 to $2,000 a year. And so I think probably you would want to make sure that, and that's with an exemption. So in addition to that low rate, you get a homeowner's exemption on Maui. I know Oahu, you'll be getting a homeowner's exemption soon. But probably that rate probably has to go up to $7 or $8. I think it's probably at the 5 range right now for most cases. But I think it has to be substantially higher. I think when you take a look at what hotels are paying, they're probably paying about $15 per thousand of value. So it needs to get probably closer to hotels versus the homeowners. But of course, there's going to be a lot of pushback. Real property taxation is not easy because there's so many constituencies that you have to deal with. And I think what Maui kind of ended up doing was they have a lot of categories to try and deal with this. So we have to work closely with the counties and the cities to make sure that they have an ample grasp on all this.
And, talking about housing, you can't talk about housing without also talking about rent. Rent itself is also at a high cost in Hawaii. Is there anything being done to provide relief for individuals or families trying to pay rent? And are there any plans to implement maybe a limitation on rent hikes or, possible rent control?
We did pass Act 57, which was, essentially the off-ramp for the eviction moratorium during the pandemic. Essentially, there was no evictions allowed during the pandemic through the governor's emergency proclamation. And so we really felt that there needed to be an off-ramp to make sure that there was some stability in getting people, making sure that they could get their federal rent relief and make sure that it was done in an orderly fashion. So those who had, the longest, who needed more time to get the assistance they needed, they were provided that opportunity. Essentially, the program was very much focused around mediation, talking with the landlords and tenants, and then, of course, making sure they had enough time to get their federal rent relief. Now, federal rent relief will dry up coming this fall. So you probably saw the last tranche of funding that the city was trying to get people to apply for. But after that is used, it's done, right? So we'll be done with that program. So this past year, we tried to get another off-ramp program to try and allow some interim financing for those who are facing evictions after that federal rent relief passed. But unfortunately, we weren't able to get that to the finish line. I think it was about $12 million that we needed that was going to be combined with, again, mediation. But again, that wasn't something that we could get past because of the high number, and there was some federal rent relief still available. So I think what the alternative is at this point is we did offer a shallow rent subsidy of $500 in what we call rent supplement, state rent supplement. So that will be offered through the Hawaii Public Housing Authority over the next year for those who are. And so this is kind of to close the gap on how to afford your rent. It's not a full subsidy like some folks are getting with the federal rent relief, but at least it's something, right? $500 hopefully will help you to figure out what's next, and it'll buy you time. So that should be rolling out, within the next couple of months if we can kind of figure out how to get that administered. And to your question about rent control, I think there was a few bills this past session that really wanted to control how much rent was increases from year to year. And I think we're going to have to take a look at that. I think when you take a look across the nation, sometimes when you put in more regulation, it's not the intended effect doesn't really have what you were hoping for. And so I think with rent control, I think that's one of those things, because I think sometimes it may drive people out of the rental market because they don't want to deal with a graduated rental scale. And so we're going to have to figure out what is the long-term effects, because I think at this time we want more renters, not less. So if you're going to, someone will make that calculation of, if I'm rent control, I'm just not going to rent and I'm just going to sell it, right? And that's off the rental market. Hopefully it goes to someone that is owner occupied. But in this market, because the interest rates are so high, likely it won't go to a local person. It possibly will go to a speculator. So we're committed to figuring out more what we can do with the landlord-tenant code, because I think there is a lot in that space where we can make some progress. But I hear a lot of what's going on out there, and we were mindful of that, and we want to make some type of difference in that area.
And as we go toward the tail end of this conversation, I was wondering, we often hear the term priced out of paradise, and we see locals having to make that tough decision of having to leave Hawaii, leave home. What do you say to locals who are on the verge of leaving because they can't afford here, or are even pondering it? What do you say to them?
I would say, I'm sorry. We have failed. We have been failing for decades, and we're trying to turn the Titanic around now so that you have a home that you can afford in the future, but it will take time. None of this will happen overnight. But I do hope that 5, 10, at some point, some number of years in the future, that we will have a pipeline of 10,000 or more units a year, so that we'll never be forcing people to make that horrible decision ever again. That every local person who wants a home in Hawaii will be able to have a home in Hawaii. And that I think is the ultimate goal here. As a legislator, as an elected official, if I had to describe the vision in one sentence, it would be a recent slogan that a labor union used, which is one job should be enough. You should be able to work one job, whether it's as a teacher or as a police officer or as a grocery checkout clerk, and not be, just barely hanging on by your fingernails, just trying to scrape by. As a state, we have the highest percentage of both parents working in the country. We have the highest percentage of people working 2 or more jobs in the country. As a state, we wake up the earliest of any state in the country, partly, I think, because people want to finish their first shift so they can get to their second shift. And that's just a horrible way to live. I think we should be able to accommodate people in the wealthiest nation on earth, working one job. If you're making that contribution to society by working full time, you should be able to have a home here and to have a family here and to have a good life here. That's why we went into public service, isn't it? I mean, we didn't do it to ensure that this incredible way of life is, just ends after us, and is available only to the extremely wealthy after us. We have a responsibility to every every future generation of Hawaii. And that's what's motivating me to do all of this.
Yes. And how about you, Representative?
Yeah, I think for the future generations, we're going to have to fight, right? And I think it's not going to be easy, but that's the whole reason why I'm in office, is because I was tired of, having my friends and colleagues and family moving to the mainland. And I said, why is that, right? And so I think all of us are going to have to step up and say we can't allow that, and we can't allow that to continue to happen. And so, I think when we have developments happening, I know people in the community will say, no, we don't want that in our community. But I think the next generation needs to say, hey, what about us? Right? Because I think there has to be some type of yes in my backyard, right? I think we've pretty much said a lot of times, no, not in my backyard. And we need to change that thinking, because if we don't change that thinking, the best and brightest are going to leave, right? And so I think the next generation is going to have to make their voice heard. We can be a voice at the legislature for you, but we need the backup, right? We need people who share that same responsibility of wanting to make change and moving the needle, and we need that assistance, right? I think we as a community need to decide where development's going to happen, and we actually have to develop in those areas because our future depends on it. And so I think we will continue to do what we do at the legislature. We will push very, very hard to try push innovative programs. We're going to get a lot of pushback sometimes, but I think our intentions are very good. We're trying to move the needle for people that are growing up today. And so we're gonna try very, very hard, but please join us.
Yes, and I guess my last question for you both is, what are your next actionable steps forward in, solving this housing crisis? What are you guys doing in this upcoming legislative session? What is your steps to, making all of this a reality?
So the 99-year leasehold model has a lot of momentum behind it. After 5 years of fighting for it, we passed the bill that we talked about earlier for HCDA to do that pilot project. The Hawaii Public Housing Authority is doing another tower at the Mayor Wright site. Representative Hashimoto talked about the UH West Oahu potential projects. UH is looking at some other potential sites as well. It seems like there are going to be at least a handful of towers that are going to be opening within the next few years that will be on this revenue neutral, income blind type of model. And I hope that those will provide the momentum to do another set of towers and more and more and more in the future. For me personally, I think the next step that we need to focus on is financing. And we've already talked about the limited capacity of taxpayers to subsidize these really expensive new projects. And I think that we could be doing a better job, a more efficient job of using these precious taxpayer dollars in a couple of ways. So first of all, these existing subsidy programs like the Rental Housing Revolving Fund and the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, a lot of people don't understand how they work, but basically they're giveaways to private developers. The taxpayer pays for 30 to 70% of the cost of a project but owns zero. The developer pays for zero and owns 100%. And one of the consequences that we see is that when those affordability periods expire, a lot of times the developer is then able to take those rents to market rate, and then there's a huge amount of pushback from those existing tenants who don't want to be displaced by the rising rates. There's a project on Kauai that is kind of in this boat, not exactly for these reasons, but the rents are ready to rise. There was a project on Maui where the rents were going to rise again because the affordability period expired, and it was perfectly legal for the developer to do that. It is perfectly legal. And that's why I would want to focus on concentrating those funds instead of just giving them to developers so that the developers can walk away with the building and raise the rents to market, or worse yet, force basically an extortionate sale to the state to prevent the displacement from happening so that the taxpayer actually now pays for the building twice, which is this incredible, absurd injustice. And yet that's what we do all the time around here. I think we need to focus on giving those funds to state and county governments that will never raise those rents to market. In other words, to keep these units permanently affordable and to prevent those developers from coming in and just being able to raise the rents and sell for a market price. So I think that's one avenue that we need to go down. I think another avenue that we need to go down is that instead of subsidizing units at this very high cost of $177,000 per unit, I think that there are more efficient ways to do what's called credit enhancement. So essentially, the state would put the money into a box, and then the state would go to a private lender, say the Bank of Emily, and the Bank of Emily might be considering a loan to Troy Hashimoto Developer Corporation. And Troy Hashimoto Development is going to have to pay the market interest rate to borrow the money from Bank of Emily. But if I, the state, come in with my box of cash and I say, you know what, I'm going to guarantee his loan, you, the bank, will be willing to offer him a significantly reduced interest rate. Because you know that if he goes under, the state will backstop that loan. And one interesting statistic that I heard is that every quarter of a point that the interest rate comes down, the rent can go down by $100 a month. And so by putting the money into a box instead of directly giving it to Troy Hashimoto Development, the state is going to be able to create 5 new units of housing, because you don't need $1 in the box for every $1 in loans. You might need only $1 in that box for every $5 in loans that you're making. That would be a much more efficient use of taxpayer funds to leverage 1 to 5 instead of 1 to 1. And I think that's a better way to deploy the funds that our hardworking taxpayers are paying into the system. So I think housing finance reform is super important. And the reason why it's important, I'm a lawyer, Emily. I used to not really think about housing finance. But the reason why I think it's important is because last year we took a delegation to the city of Vienna, Austria. And Vienna, so in America, we pour billions of dollars a year into subsidizing new housing construction. The city of Vienna, which is openly socialist, they're called Red Vienna, they put 0 new taxpayer dollars a year into subsidizing new housing construction. And yet they're able to produce enough housing every year to house 60% of their population in public housing, which is incredible. Everyone who wants one can get one in Vienna. And the way that they're able to do it is through these means of financing. It might be complicated, it might be hard for the average, kind of layperson to understand, but I think it's important to understand it because if we're able to make these taxpayer subsidy programs more efficient, we can create a perpetual motion machine, and we can produce thousands of units a year instead of the couple hundred units or the handful of units a year that we're building today.
Yes, and Representative Hashimoto, in our last couple of minutes, is there anything that you'd like to add with your last words of what your next steps are?
So a lot of my focus is really on implementation right now, because we actually have a lot of money out there in the universe. You got to remember that we have $600 million for Department of Hawaiian Homelands that we still need to digest. So I've been the chair of the Oversight Committee. We've encumbered about $193 million thus far. So there's a far more money we have to spend before it lapses. We will be looking at all the various agencies to see how they can be more timely in building developments for the state. I think it's a great concept that Senator Chang brought up, that we should do more state-owned developments. But I think the problem really is we need to have people within those state agencies that are able to do it in a timely manner. And so that's why when he talks about a low-income housing tax credit project, why we're giving it away to private developers is because they're the ones who can do it in a timely manner, right? Timing matters. We want to see somebody live in a unit. And so it's making sure that we can reform some of these agencies to make sure that they move faster, more efficiently, and making sure that they get these projects done. I think a lot of it will also be focusing on the nuts and bolts of why things are taking a long time. Coming up this coming week, we will see the governor issue an emergency proclamation on housing. And I think that will be very interesting to see how the public reacts to that. I think the challenge for the legislature is going to be, we will take a look at that and all the components that it'll have. And we will really see if we can actually implement that for the long term. Because you got to remember, the governor is going to issue this emergency proclamation. He's going to suspend a lot of laws. He's going to do things outside the normal course of government. But I think if we want to see long-term success, we have to do it permanently, and the legislature will have to enact that. So that's going to be a very big project for us this coming legislative session, to see if we can enact any of those things that are included in the emergency proclamation.
Well, yes, we definitely delved into a lot of this, and it'll really be interesting to see how that emergency proclamation affects, housing moving forward. And I really just appreciate you both taking the time to, answer viewer questions and also just discuss this topic that is so pertinent and important for the people of Hawaii. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
You can watch and listen to more of the Debrief at hawaiinewsnow.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Hope you tune in next week. This is your host, Emily Cristobal, and mahalo for listening.